Steve Harvey had spent over 15 years hosting Family Feud, navigating thousands of episodes with his signature blend of humor, wisdom, and genuine connection with the families who appeared on his stage. He had witnessed awkward moments, hilarious misunderstandings, touching displays of family love, and occasional tensions that arose from the competitive nature of the show. However, nothing in his extensive television career could have prepared him for what would unfold on that humid August afternoon in 2024, when a single word spoken by a husband about his wife would stop the game completely and trigger a response from Steve that would reveal everything he believed about respect, marriage, and the fundamental value of human beings. The Thompson family from Birmingham, Alabama stood ready to compete against the Chen family from Seattle, Washington, both families appearing excited and eager to participate in America's favorite game show. But beneath the carefully practiced smiles and coordinated outfits, a toxic undercurrent was about to surface that would leave the studio audience stunned, the production crew uncomfortable, and Steve Harvey visibly shaken by the casual cruelty he was about to witness. If you appreciate stories that remind us of the importance of respect and dignity in relationships, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful content about real families and real moments. Robert and Patricia Thompson had been married for 19 years, though anyone observing them closely might have questioned how those years had been spent based on the dynamics visible even before the game began. Robert was 47 years old, a successful corporate attorney whose expensive suit and confident bearing spoke of professional achievement and financial security. He carried himself with the self-assured posture of someone accustomed to winning arguments and controlling rooms, his body language suggesting he viewed the Family Feud stage as simply another arena where his superior intellect and quick thinking would lead to victory. Patricia, 43, stood beside her husband in a modest dress that seemed almost deliberately plain compared to Robert's tailored attire. She had spent the last 16 years as a homemaker after leaving her position as a teacher when their first child was born, dedicating herself entirely to raising their 3 children and maintaining their household according to Robert's exacting standards. Their children completed the family lineup on stage. 16-year-old Melissa stood between her parents, her posture slightly hunched as if trying to make herself smaller and less noticeable. 13-year-old Brandon fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting between his father and the cameras with visible anxiety. 10-year-old Sophie clutched her mother's hand tightly, her small face reflecting a seriousness that seemed inappropriate for a child her age appearing on what should have been a fun family game show. To the casual observer, they might have appeared to be simply a nervous family, perhaps intimidated by the cameras and the prospect of competing on national television. But those watching more carefully would have noticed the way Patricia seemed to defer to Robert in every small interaction, the way the children's eyes constantly sought their father's approval, the subtle but unmistakable atmosphere of tension that surrounded the Thompson family, even in what should have been a moment of shared excitement. What the studio audience and viewers at home could not fully understand was the reality of life in the Thompson household, a reality that Patricia and the children navigated daily with careful attention to Robert's moods and expectations. Robert Thompson was a man who had built his identity around being the smartest person in any room, the one whose opinions mattered most, the individual whose success in his career translated in his mind to superiority in all aspects of life. He had strong opinions about everything from politics to parenting, from financial management to how his wife should dress and speak. He expressed these opinions frequently and expected them to be accepted without question or debate. Over the 19 years of their marriage, Robert had systematically diminished Patricia's sense of self-worth through a steady stream of criticism disguised as helpful feedback or honest observation. He would comment on her appearance, suggesting she had let herself go since their early dating years. He would dismiss her opinions on current events, reminding her that she had been out of the professional world for so long that her perspectives were outdated and uninformed. He would make jokes at her expense in front of friends and family, then accuse her of being too sensitive when she expressed hurt or embarrassment. He controlled the family finances completely, providing Patricia with an allowance for household expenses, but requiring detailed accounting of every purchase and questioning any expenditure he deemed unnecessary or frivolous. Patricia had gradually learned to minimize herself in the marriage, to defer to Robert's judgment, to avoid expressing opinions that might trigger his condescension or ridicule. She had stopped pursuing her own interests or maintaining friendships that Robert found annoying or inconvenient. She had become skilled at reading his moods and adjusting her behavior accordingly, always trying to anticipate what would please him or at least avoid provoking his displeasure. The children had learned similar survival strategies, becoming quiet and compliant in their father's presence, saving their authentic selves for moments when he was at work or otherwise occupied. The Family Feud appearance had been Robert's idea, conceived as an opportunity to showcase his family and his own quick wit on national television. He had prepared extensively, studying common survey answers and strategizing about optimal approaches to different types of questions. He had instructed his family on how to behave on camera, what to say if interviewed, and how to properly represent the Thompson name. Patricia had gone along with the plan as she went along with all of Robert's decisions, helping the children practice and trying to manage her own anxiety about appearing on television while knowing that any mistakes would be subject to Robert's criticism later. The game began with the usual energy and excitement that characterized Family Feud. Steve Harvey worked the room with his practiced charisma, engaging both families with jokes and creating an atmosphere of fun competition. The Thompsons won the initial face-off question, and Robert immediately took control of the game with an authoritative confidence that seemed excessive even for the competitive environment of a game show. He consulted with his family members in a manner that appeared collaborative on the surface, but actually involved him overruling their suggestions and implementing his own answers while barely acknowledging their input. The first 2 rounds progressed with the Thompson family performing adequately, though not exceptionally. Robert provided several correct answers with a smugness that was beginning to make even Steve Harvey slightly uncomfortable. When his answers were not on the board, he would make dismissive comments about the survey respondents' intelligence or taste. When Patricia or the children offered suggestions that turned out to be incorrect, Robert would shake his head with visible disappointment, as if their failures reflected poorly on him personally and professionally. It was during the 3rd round that the moment occurred which would stop the game and trigger Steve Harvey's most powerful response in his years of hosting. The question appeared on the board, seeming innocuous enough in its wording, but destined to reveal something dark and ugly about the Thompson family dynamics. Steve read the question with his characteristic dramatic flair, building anticipation before revealing what the families would be attempting to answer. "We surveyed 100 married men," Steve announced, his voice carrying through the studio. "Name something about your wife that makes her irreplaceable." The question was designed to elicit sweet, sentimental answers about the unique qualities that made each wife special to her husband. Expected responses might include her laugh, her kindness, the way she mothers their children, her loyalty, her particular talents or quirks that defined her individuality. These were the types of heartwarming answers that made Family Feud a show families could watch together, celebrating the bonds of love and partnership that held marriages together through decades of shared life. Robert Thompson buzzed in quickly, beating the Chen family to the opportunity to provide the first answer. Steve turned to him with an encouraging smile, ready for what he assumed would be a touching tribute to Patricia that would score points both on the board and in the hearts of the viewing audience. The studio audience waited with the pleasant anticipation that came from expecting to hear a husband express appreciation for his wife on national television. Robert's response came without hesitation, delivered in a tone that suggested he found the entire premise of the question somewhat absurd. "Nothing. My wife is not irreplaceable. Anyone can do what she does." The words hung in the air for several seconds as brains throughout the studio struggled to process what had just been said. Steve Harvey's smile froze on his face, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion to dawning comprehension of the profound disrespect that had just been casually expressed. The studio audience fell into shocked silence, the collective gasp of hundreds of people who had just witnessed something far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even in the competitive context of a game show. Patricia's face flushed deep red, a combination of humiliation and pain washing over her features as her husband's assessment of her worth was broadcast to hundreds of people in the studio and would soon be heard by millions watching at home. Her hand tightened around Sophie's, and tears immediately began forming in her eyes, though she fought desperately to maintain composure. The children stood frozen, Melissa's mouth literally hanging open in shock at hearing her father publicly express such contempt for their mother, Brandon's face reflecting both embarrassment and a terrible lack of surprise that suggested this was not the first time such sentiments had been voiced. Steve Harvey stood completely still for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. His face went through a visible transformation as he processed not just what had been said but the casual cruelty with which it had been delivered, the complete lack of awareness or remorse on Robert's face, the devastating impact visible on Patricia and the children. When Steve finally spoke, his voice had lost all traces of the jovial game show host persona, and instead carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize genuine toxicity when it presented itself. "I am sorry, what did you just say?" Steve's question was not a request for clarification. It was an opportunity for Robert to recognize the enormity of what he had just expressed and perhaps walk it back. It was a chance for redemption that Steve was offering despite his own visceral reaction to what he had heard. Robert, however, seemed oblivious to the offer being extended or the gravity of the moment. He responded with the same casual dismissiveness, apparently interpreting Steve's question as genuine confusion about his answer rather than shocked disbelief at his disrespect. "I said my wife is not irreplaceable. The question does not make sense because there is nothing unique about what she does. She takes care of the house and the kids. Millions of women do that. If she were not here, I could hire someone to do those same tasks, or I could remarry. She is not irreplaceable in any objective sense." The studio audience's shocked silence gave way to audible expressions of dismay and disapproval. Several women in the audience could be heard making sounds of disgust and anger. The Chen family stood at their podium looking profoundly uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were anywhere else, but witnessing this moment of marital toxicity playing out on national television. The production crew exchanged glances that communicated their shared discomfort and uncertainty about how to proceed. Steve Harvey took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an intensity that silenced the murmuring audience and commanded complete attention from everyone in the studio. "Robert Thompson, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. I'm going to stop this game, and I'm going to tell you some things that you clearly need to hear, and I do not care if this takes 5 minutes or 50 minutes because what just happened here cannot go unaddressed." Robert looked confused and slightly irritated, as if Steve was overreacting to a simple game show answer and interrupting what should have been a straightforward competition. But something in Steve's expression and tone prevented him from voicing whatever dismissive response he might have been considering. "In my 15 years of hosting this show," Steve continued, his voice steady but carrying an edge of controlled anger, "I have heard a lot of answers. I have heard stupid answers and funny answers and sweet answers and shocking answers. But what you just said about your wife is the most disrespectful, degrading, and frankly disgusting thing I have ever heard a man say about his spouse on this stage or anywhere else." Steve turned to look directly at Patricia, his expression softening with genuine compassion. "Ma'am, I do not know you. I do not know your story or what your marriage has been like for these 19 years. But I want you to hear me when I say this, and I want everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home to hear it too. You are not replaceable. You are not a collection of tasks that could be performed by anyone else. You are a human being with inherent worth and dignity that has nothing to do with what you do for your husband or your children." He continued addressing Patricia while the cameras captured every moment. "You have spent 16 years raising 3 children, managing a household, supporting your husband's career by taking care of everything at home so he could focus on his work. You have loved your children through every stage of their development. You have been there for every scraped knee and bad dream and hard day at school. You have been the constant presence in their lives while their father was building his career. And none of that is replaceable by hiring someone or finding another wife, because those things came from you specifically, from your love and your dedication and your unique self." Steve turned back to Robert, and the compassion that had been in his voice when addressing Patricia was replaced by something much harder and more challenging. "Robert, let me tell you what I see when I look at this situation. I see a man who has become so focused on his own importance that he has forgotten the most basic principle of human decency, which is that every person has value that goes beyond what they can do for you. I see a man who has spent so long being successful in his career that he thinks success gives him the right to look down on people who make different choices or have different roles." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Steve held up his hand firmly. "I am not finished. You need to hear this because your children are standing right here watching and listening, and they need to hear their father confronted with truth, even if he chooses not to accept it. What you just said about your wife tells me several things about you, and none of them are good. It tells me you view your wife as an employee rather than a partner. It tells me you have no understanding of or appreciation for the sacrifice she has made in giving up her own career to support yours. It tells me you think the only work that matters is work that gets paid in money, rather than work that builds a family and raises children." The studio was completely silent except for Steve's voice, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Patricia was crying openly now, though whether from humiliation or the unexpected experience of having someone defend her worth so forcefully was unclear. The children looked stunned, unaccustomed to hearing anyone speak to their father in such direct terms or challenge his perspective on anything. Steve's voice grew even more intense as he continued. "But what concerns me most, Robert, is not just what you think about your wife, but what you are teaching your children about relationships and respect and human value. Your daughter is 16 years old. She is watching you treat her mother as disposable and interchangeable. What do you think that teaches her about her own worth? What do you think that teaches her about what she should accept from men in her life? Your sons are watching you dismiss and demean their mother. What do you think that teaches them about how to treat women? About what makes a man worthy of respect?" Robert's face had gone from confused to defensive to genuinely uncomfortable as Steve's words hit their target. For perhaps the first time in the conversation, he seemed to recognize that he was not dealing with someone he could dismiss or talk over, that Steve Harvey was going to hold him accountable for what he had said regardless of Robert's professional status or debating skills. "I want to tell you something I learned in my own journey," Steve said, his tone shifting slightly to incorporate hard-won wisdom rather than just confrontation. "I have been married 3 times. I have made terrible mistakes in relationships. I have been the man who thought his success and his career made him more important than the woman standing beside him. And I am here to tell you that path leads nowhere good. It leads to broken families and damaged children and a life where you end up successful and alone because you destroyed everyone who loved you by treating them as less important than yourself." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "You said your wife could be replaced by hiring someone or marrying someone else. Let me tell you what you cannot replace. You cannot replace 19 years of shared history. You cannot replace the mother your children know and love. You cannot replace the woman who chose to tie her life to yours when you were younger and less successful. You cannot replace the thousands of small moments of support and sacrifice that have gone into building the life you now enjoy. You cannot replace trust and partnership and the unique connection that comes from 2 people building a life together over nearly 2 decades." Steve turned to address the studio audience and the cameras directly. "Everyone watching this needs to understand something fundamental about marriage and partnership. Your spouse is not your employee. Your spouse is not someone performing services that could be outsourced or replaced. Your spouse is a human being who has chosen to share their life with you, who deserves respect and appreciation and recognition of their inherent worth as a person, not just as someone who performs tasks for your benefit." He looked back at Robert with an expression that combined disappointment and challenge. "Robert, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. If your wife stood here and said that you were replaceable, that she could find another attorney to provide financial support or hire someone to pay the bills, that there was nothing unique about what you bring to this family, how would that make you feel?" For the first time, Robert's defensive posture cracked slightly. The hypothetical scenario, when applied to himself, apparently penetrated his emotional armor in a way that direct criticism had not. His face showed a flicker of genuine discomfort as he contemplated being on the receiving end of the same dismissive assessment he had so casually applied to his wife. "That would feel terrible," Robert admitted quietly, his voice lacking the confident assertion that had characterized his earlier responses. "That would make me feel like I did not matter, like our relationship was purely transactional." "Exactly," Steve said, seizing on this moment of breakthrough. "That is exactly how your wife feels right now after hearing you describe her as replaceable in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers. That is exactly what you communicated to your children about their mother's value. That is exactly the damage you have done with your words today." Steve let that reality settle for a moment before speaking again, his tone becoming slightly more gentle though still firm in its message. "Robert, I am not telling you this to humiliate you or to make myself look good at your expense. I am telling you this because I can see where this path leads if you do not change course. I can see the impact your attitude is having on your wife and your children. I can see a family that is going to fall apart if something does not fundamentally shift in how you view and treat the people who love you." He paused before delivering what would become the most quoted moment from this entire exchange. "You are successful in your career. You are probably very good at arguing cases and winning negotiations. But Robert, you are failing at the most important role you will ever have, which is being a good husband and father. And unlike lost court cases, you cannot appeal or retry failed relationships. When your wife finally has enough of being treated as disposable, when your children distance themselves because they are tired of watching you demean their mother, when you end up successful and alone because everyone who loved you got tired of being treated as less important than you, there is no do-over. There is no second chance at those specific relationships with those specific people. The weight of Steve's words hung heavy in the studio air. Patricia was still crying, but her posture had changed subtly. Instead of the hunched, defeated bearing she had displayed earlier, she stood slightly straighter, as if Steve's defense of her worth had reminded her of something she had forgotten about herself over years of being diminished. The children looked between their father and Steve Harvey with expressions that suggested they were witnessing something significant, a confrontation of truths they had lived with but never heard articulated so directly. Robert stood silent for a long moment, his face reflecting an internal struggle between his habitual defensiveness and a dawning recognition that perhaps his perspective had been fundamentally flawed. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, and less certain than before. "I did not think about it that way. I was just answering the question honestly based on how I see things." "And that is the problem," Steve responded immediately. "The way you see things is wrong. The way you see your wife, the way you see her contributions to your family, the way you assess human worth based on economic replaceability, all of that is fundamentally wrong. And if you do not change how you see these things, you are going to lose everything that actually matters while thinking you are being logical and honest." Steve made a decision in that moment that would have significant implications for how this situation was handled. "We are stopping this game right now. This is not about Family Feud anymore. This is about a family in crisis, and it needs to be addressed properly rather than continuing to play a game and pretending everything is fine." He turned to Patricia directly. "Ma'am, I want to connect you with some resources. I want you to talk to a counselor who can help you process what your marriage has been and what you want it to be going forward. I want you to understand that you have worth and value that has nothing to do with your husband's assessment of you. And I want you to know that you have choices about your future that you might not feel you have right now." Patricia nodded through her tears, unable to speak but clearly affected by Steve's words and his offer of support. Steve then addressed the children directly. "Melissa, Brandon, Sophie, I want you to remember something. The way your father spoke about your mother today is not okay. It is not normal. It is not how people who love each other should speak about or treat each other. As you grow up and form your own relationships, I want you to remember this moment and make different choices. I want you to treat your future partners with respect and expect to be treated with respect in return." The production staff had been conferring quietly during this exchange, and they approached Steve to discuss next steps. After a brief conversation, Steve announced that the taping would be paused to give the Thompson family privacy and time to process what had occurred. The Chen family was thanked for their patience and invited to return for a different taping. The studio audience was asked to respect the Thompson family's privacy as they dealt with what had become a deeply personal and painful situation. In a private room away from cameras and audiences, Steve spent over an hour talking with the Thompson family. He spoke separately with Patricia, encouraging her to recognize her own worth and consider what she truly wanted for her future. He spoke with the children, reassuring them that their family's struggles were not their fault and encouraging them to maintain their own sense of worth regardless of their father's attitudes. And he spoke with Robert at length, pushing him to examine not just what he had said on stage, but the underlying beliefs and behaviors that had led to that moment. Robert struggled through this conversation, his defensive mechanisms battling against the uncomfortable truth that his entire approach to his marriage and family had been damaging and wrong. Steve was relentless in his honesty, but also compassionate in recognizing that changing deeply held beliefs and behaviors would require genuine work and commitment. He connected Robert with information about counseling and resources for men struggling with issues of control and respect in relationships. When the episode was being prepared for broadcast several weeks later, the production team faced difficult decisions about what to air. After extensive discussion with Steve Harvey and consulting with family relationship experts, they decided to broadcast the confrontation with appropriate context and resources for viewers who might recognize similar dynamics in their own relationships. The episode would include information about domestic emotional abuse, resources for people experiencing disrespect in marriages, and strong messaging about the difference between healthy partnerships and relationships based on one partner's diminishment of the other. When the episode aired 2 months after the taping, The response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Steve Harvey confronting Robert Thompson went viral within hours, viewed tens of millions of times across social media platforms. The response was largely supportive of Steve's intervention, with countless viewers expressing appreciation for his willingness to stop the game and address what he recognized as a toxic dynamic playing out on his stage. Many women shared their own stories of being made to feel replaceable or worthless by partners who dismissed their contributions and diminished their value. Relationship experts praised the episode as an important public conversation about emotional abuse and the subtle ways partners can demean each other over time. Marriage counselors reported increases in people seeking help after recognizing patterns from their own relationships in what they had witnessed on Family Feud. Domestic violence organizations noted the value of having such a high-profile platform address the reality that abuse is not always physical, that words and attitudes can be deeply damaging even without violence. For the Thompson family, the aftermath of that day on the Family Feud stage became a turning point, though not in any simple or straightforward way. Patricia did begin counseling, as Steve had suggested, working with a therapist who specialized in helping people recover their sense of self-worth after years of emotional diminishment. Through this work, she began to recognize patterns in her marriage that she had normalized over time, behaviors and attitudes that were not acceptable or healthy regardless of how common they might have become in her daily life. Robert also entered counseling, though his journey was more complicated and resistant. He struggled to accept that his perspective had been fundamentally flawed, that his treatment of Patricia constituted a form of abuse even though he had never raised his hand to her or called her names. He grappled with examining his own childhood and the messages he had absorbed about masculinity, success, and the relative value of different types of work and contribution. Progress was slow and marked by setbacks, but he did begin the difficult work of examining and changing beliefs that had been central to his identity for decades. 6 months after the episode aired, Patricia made a decision that she would have considered impossible before that day on the Family Feud stage. She separated from Robert, moving with the children into a small apartment while she continued her therapy and considered what she wanted for her future. The separation was not driven by hatred or even by the public humiliation of what had happened on television. It was driven by Patricia's growing recognition of her own worth and her unwillingness to continue accepting treatment that diminished her humanity and modeled unhealthy relationship dynamics for her children. The separation forced Robert to confront the real possibility of losing his family, not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate reality. Faced with the consequences of years of dismissive treatment and controlling behavior, he intensified his commitment to counseling and to genuine change, rather than surface-level adjustments designed to bring Patricia back without addressing underlying issues. He began attending a men's group focused on healthy masculinity and respectful partnerships. He started doing the actual work of examining his privilege, his assumptions, and his patterns of relating to others from a position of superiority rather than partnership. 1 year after that fateful Family Feud appearance, Patricia and Robert were still separated, but engaged in intensive couples counseling to explore whether their marriage could be rebuilt on a healthier foundation. Patricia had returned to teaching part-time, rediscovering the professional identity she had set aside 16 years earlier, and reconnecting with the sense of competence and value that came from work she found meaningful. The children were in therapy to process the impact of years of witnessing their mother being diminished and to learn healthier models of relationships and respect. The outcome remained uncertain. Patricia was clear that she would not return to the marriage unless she saw sustained, genuine change in how Robert viewed her and treated her. Robert was discovering that changing deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior required far more work than he had initially imagined. But both were committed to the process, not necessarily to preserving the marriage at all costs, but to ensuring that whatever path they chose moving forward would be healthier for themselves and their children than what had come before. Steve Harvey maintained contact with the Thompson family throughout this period, checking in periodically to see how they were progressing and offering encouragement and resources when needed. In interviews about the episode and his confrontation of Robert Thompson, Steve was consistent in his message about respect, partnership, and the fundamental dignity of all human beings regardless of their role or contribution measured in economic terms. That episode was difficult to film and difficult to watch, Steve said in one such interview. But I would make the same choice again to stop that game and address what I was witnessing. When you have a platform like I do, when you are in a position to speak truth to someone who desperately needs to hear it, you have a responsibility to use that platform for good. I could not let that man's words go unchallenged, not when his wife and children were standing right there absorbing the message that she was worthless and replaceable. The episode became one of the most discussed in Family Feud history, referenced in conversations about healthy relationships, used in domestic violence awareness campaigns, and studied in academic contexts examining the role of media in addressing social issues. But beyond its cultural impact, it represented a moment when entertainment television became something more, when a game show host recognized a responsibility that transcended the format and used his platform to speak uncomfortable truth to power and dignity to someone who had forgotten her own worth. For Patricia Thompson specifically, that moment on the Family Feud stage when Steve Harvey stopped the game to tell her she was not replaceable became a turning point in reclaiming her sense of self. In later conversations with counselors and in her own reflections, she would identify that public defense of her worth as the moment when she began to believe again that she mattered as a person, not just as someone who performed tasks for others. It was the moment when she started to consider that the way she had been treated was not acceptable or inevitable, that she deserved better and had the power to demand it. If this story has reinforced your understanding of the fundamental dignity and worth of every person, of the importance of respect in relationships, and of the courage required to confront toxic dynamics even when doing so is uncomfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful stories because we believe authentic conversations about difficult topics matter. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that addresses life's challenges with honesty and compassion. Thank you for being part of this community and for recognizing that every person has irreplaceable worth that goes far beyond what they do or provide for others.